So I'm going to really focus on protein today and understanding protein as it relates to feeding growing calves. This is the one group of animals where the crude protein system doesn't really work very well for us. And I often get asked to do growing rations, and a lot of times with those growing rations, I'll get asked, well, can I do it with alfalfa? And the answer is yes, but it really depends on your goals and what you're trying to accomplish. So I kind of wanted to go through and help you understand some things about protein today, and then what we'll do is we'll start a discussion and try to answer some of the questions you might have. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is show you some data. I'm a scientist and I love data. So if we look at this particular experiment, this was an experiment where they had 500-pound calves, these are all steers actually, that were on corn residue, and they were either not supplemented, so they were grazing corn residue and they were not supplemented. They were supplemented with corn at basically 3.75 pounds per head per day. They were supplemented with corn with 5% urea. So they got a little bit more supplement. So they actually had the same amount of energy in the supplement. So they were supplemented a little over 3 pounds per head there. And then they were supplemented with distillers. And in this case, you can see that the distillers group also received the same amount of energy. So they received less distillers because it's more energy dense. So the thing to really notice here is that all the supplements had the same amount of energy. The corn, of course, had less protein than the corn plus urea or the distillers if we look at it on a crude protein basis. But the corn plus urea and the distillers group had the same levels here of crude protein. So now I'm going to ask you what you think the calves did. So how did the corn plus urea calves perform relative to the distillers calves? So I started a poll here. I'm going to ask you to vote and tell us how you did. By the way, this is anonymous, so nobody's going to laugh if you get it wrong. I want to see how you think they performed. And then we'll kind of talk about how they performed and maybe why that is. So I've got about 10 responses so far. We'll just keep going here for a second. Okay, I got about 20 responses. Most of you voted. All right, we got 21. That's pretty good. I'm going to go ahead and end the poll here. So I'm going to share the results. Can everybody see my results here? If we look at how the cattle performed, most people thought that the corn plus urea gained less. A few people thought the corn plus urea gained more than the distillers. And then another few people here thought that the corn plus urea gained the same. So as we think about the performance, a lot of people said corn plus urea gained less than the distillers, and they would be correct. So if we look at the performance of these animals, the corn plus urea, of course, they gained only about half a pound a day, whereas the distillers group gained 1.32 pounds. Now, remember, if we look at the difference in these two, crude protein was the same, energy was the same. What's going on? Well, this is where it comes down to the difference between urea as a protein source and it being a source of Rumen degradable protein, and distillers being a Rumen undegradable protein source. And so if we look at what that actually means, then we've got to get into a little bit of some basic ruminant nutrition here. And I'm going to kind of show you a little bit about how the protein system works in a very, very basic form. but hopefully you'll remember it. So as I mentioned, we have kind of two forms of protein. We have Rumen degradable protein and we have Rumen undegradable protein. And they are exactly what they sound like. There's the one type of protein that can be degraded in the rumen. And so it becomes available to the microbes in the rumen. And those microbes will actually break it down and they will use it to grow and multiply. And then those microbes that grow and multiply eventually get washed out of the rumen and become a source of protein to the animal. So they actually wash down their digestive tract and get absorbed as a source of protein to the animal, just like any protein source we might consume. Okay, so that's what happens if there's enough energy in the system for those microbes to use that Rumen degradable protein source to grow and multiply. If not, they'll actually break down that Rumen degradable protein and they'll use the carbon that's in it for energy, and they will release the nitrogen in the form of ammonia. So in the case of Rumen degradable protein, we only get as much microbial crude protein, or the amount of microbes, as the energy will allow us relative to the amount of Rumen degradable protein. So if we add a little corn into the system where we don't have enough energy, we can actually increase the utilization of Rumen degradable protein so that ammonia and that corn can work together and become more microbes again. And so it's all about the microbes if we think about Rumen degradable protein. The source to the animal is just the microbes. Now, the other source that I talked about is Rumen undegradable protein. And again, it's just what it sounds like. It doesn't get degraded in the rumen. And so it just kind of washes through the rumen and becomes a source of amino acids or protein for the animal itself. If indeed that animal can utilize that protein, it will utilize it to grow, right? It can use it to make muscle, it can use it to make immune cells, it can use it to make enzymes, anything the proteins needed for, just like those bacteria or microbes were being used as a protein source. However, if we overfeed Rumen undegradable protein relative to the amount of energy available in the diet, the animals will do much like the microbes, and they'll break it down and use the carbon as an energy source to grow and make more muscle, or use it as energy to maintain their body, or use it as energy to store fat, whatever it may be. And they also, of course, break off that nitrogen and release it, and they have to detoxify it. So in the case of Rumen undegradable protein, it really is the source that the animal can use. It doesn't go through the microbes and become like a secondary type of protein source. And then also, if we overfeed it, it can become energy. And in fact, that's one of the reasons why distillers can be such a high energy source, because the protein, that bypass protein, is actually quite high in energy in terms of availability. So protein available to the animal simply is, I say simply, and I showed you these big diagrams, but simply is the microbial crude protein plus the Rumen undegradable protein. That's what's available to the animal. And any given feed stuff, with the exception of something like urea, we typically have Rumen degradable and Rumen undegradable protein. And so it's the combination of those two and how they form microbial crude protein and that Rumen undegradable protein to be available as metabolizable protein to the animal. So the things to really understand about that is that microbial crude protein production is really dependent, as I mentioned, on the balance of the amount of Rumen available energy and Rumen available nitrogen or protein. And so if we continue to feed, let's say I've got a really high quality alfalfa hay, you know, dairy quality, it's 24 or 25% crude protein, and I give that to my calves and I expect I'm going to have really high rates of gain. Well, in fact, what may happen is that we actually don't have enough energy to make use of all of that protein, and so we don't get as high gains as we think we should. And if we just provide a little bit more energy, like provide them some corn, we'll boost the performance. When it comes to microbial crude protein production in forage-based diets, it's really hard to get enough microbial crude protein to sustain high rates of gain, especially if we're talking about lighter weight calves. So the smaller the calf, the higher the relative protein requirement is. So 400 versus 700, if we think about relative protein requirements, a 400-pound calf has a much higher protein requirement than a 700-pound calf. And then if you get to an 8 or a 9, it goes down from there as well. Ruminally undegradable protein is the protein that's available to the animal, and again, it can be used as an energy source to the animal if it's fed in excess. Okay, so what does that all mean? What does that all look like? Well, here I just have some common protein sources that I often get asked about and kind of their makeup. So I have here the crude protein content of the feed and on a dry matter basis, and urea is pretty much nothing but nitrogen, so it's very high in crude protein. It's 281% on a dry matter basis. It's all ruminally degradable protein. There is no protein that is bypassed or ruminally undegradable. So I kind of have these listed as the most ruminally degradable to the least ruminally degradable, and you might see down here distillers grains is one of the least ruminally degradable protein sources that we might typically feed in our beef systems. Cottonseed meal being up there as well, a little bit higher in ruminally undegradable protein content. But you see that the one I wanted to show you, alfalfa hay, is a question I get often, and it is variable in crude protein content, as you all know. You know, it can vary from as low as 10. By the way, I do see those numbers. And as high as 27. I don't see those very often unless I'm looking at somebody who's trying to sell dairy hay. And from a standpoint of the amount of ruminally degradable protein, it does vary a bit depending on the quality, but you can see that it's majority of that hay would be ruminally degradable protein. And so it's really going to feed the microbes. There's not much there to bypass and feed the animal without using those microbes as your source of protein. Also want to point out pretty much all of our forages kind of fit that high ruminally degradable protein. So grass, for instance, even if it's a high quality grass, will also be mostly ruminally degradable protein. And then we see soybean meal here because that's another one I sometimes get questions about. It's also fairly low in ruminally undegradable protein. So you see why distillers is kind of different and why a lot of times we talk about distillers. It does make life pretty easy for us as nutritionists because it is ruminally undegradable. If we do overfeed it, they use it as energy. And sometimes it's a low-cost source of energy, not just protein. And so that really makes life easy. That's not always the case, but sometimes it is. Okay, so I want to talk about a few other basic concepts before we move into really the discussion phase here. And one of those is the fact that smaller calves have higher protein requirements. And I often get questions where we will have calves that maybe have a wide range of weights, or where they want run ration to feed for a long period of time. And really what I wanted to show you here is just the relative difference in requirement for, say, a 400 all the way down to an 800-pound calf. And if you just look at the energy required to gain 1 pound or 2 pounds for those calves, what you really see is that lighter weight calves have a higher relative protein requirement than a heavier weight calf. And so if we look at that, what that means is the balance of energy to protein, I can get away with much less protein the heavier they get. So that really does affect where we want to sit in terms of how we feed those calves, and it can have some impacts on what your result is in a particular diet if you have some range in groups. And I know this is a widespread, this is 300 pounds, and that's really just to show you and emphasize what's going on, but even difference between 400 and 500 is fairly large. Okay, so what I have here is I basically have a situation where I have a 400-pound calf and a 700-pound calf, and I'm going to feed them free choice meadow hay, and it's going to be some good meadow hay. So TDN is 58 and crude protein is 10, so it's some good stuff. I give it to them free choice and they eat as much as they can, and this 400-pound calf can gain about 0.2 pounds a day, and the 700-pound calf can gain about double that. And the difference here is because of their relative requirements. However, if I look at feeding them, I could give them both a little bit of corn and increase their performance. But again, look at the relative difference of what I could accomplish. So if I use up all the nitrogen in the system with that corn, I can increase my performance a bit, basically double it in the 400-pound calf, but I'm still only about ½ pound a day, whereas my 700-pound calf, I'm about 1 pound a day. So if I fed this the same ration, so just meadow hay, you see that the difference between these two is going to expand over the feeding period. I'm actually going to make the smaller calves relatively smaller and the larger calves relatively larger. So if you wanted to avoid that, you actually have to do something where you make sure you meet the protein requirement of the smaller calf, which again, protein is not always cheap, and so maybe it's even better if you can split the two. But if you can't, then you're going to need to do something where you can increase the gain of the smaller calf by adding some protein. So in this case, I just used some really good hay, some alfalfa hay here. I added a little less than 1 pound, and look at how much I could bump up their gain. Now, if I fed that same ration to my 700-pound calf, I don't improve my performance really any relative to the lightweight calf. So you can kind of see that relatively speaking, I don't get much for my money out of the 700-pounder if I'm adding the alfalfa hay, but I sure do on this lightweight calf. So protein becomes really important on lightweight calves. 400- or 500-pound calves, we really got to concentrate on the protein. Okay, so now alfalfa as a protein source is again, it's a question I get a lot, especially from western Nebraska. And I always get, well, I have alfalfa hay and I have some other feed stuff. In this case, I used corn silage as my example. And what I did is I just took some relative ranges of quality of alfalfa hay that I see, and I ran a ration. And so what I did is I did what I normally do when I make a ration for somebody and they don't know the quality. I kind of picked an average mid-range alfalfa hay, so this mid-bloom, and I made a ration. So this ration was 5.8 pounds of alfalfa hay as fed and 21 pounds of corn silage. And they could gain 1.5 pounds a day on that. However, if I overestimated the quality of that alfalfa hay, then they're actually going to perform much less than that 1.5. And so if we go up here and we just look at, I mean, not that bad of alfalfa hay for most people who have cow quality alfalfa hay, 14% crude protein and 50 TDN. And now I'm a difference of a little over ½ pound a day in gain because I assumed this. So I assumed this quality, right? But I had this quality. And if I knew that going in, I would have changed how much of the alfalfa hay I fed to change how much my average daily gain is. I also will show you that on the other end, if I underestimated the quality, in this case, I don't get any boost in performance because the quality was better than I predicted. And that's because I actually need more energy relative to the amount of protein that I'm now providing. And so again, I could adjust that ration if I knew that and either feed less alfalfa hay and still get the same amount of gain, or I could add some corn and boost their gain even further. So the bottom line here is that if you really want to get the most bang for your buck and you're going to use something like alfalfa hay, or really if you're going to have forage as the base of a diet, having a test and knowing the protein content of your forage sources can be extremely valuable when we're talking about growing calf diets. And hay is extremely variable. Okay, so I already kind of showed you that idea that distillers and urea plus corn are really kind of different. But I wanted to show you again, this is an example with alfalfa hay. And what I did here is I made a ration using some high quality alfalfa hay to gain about 1.6 pounds a day if I was feeding corn silage ad libitum, which is often a question I get. So I have corn silage, I'll feed it ad lib, and then how much alfalfa hay do I need to feed? And so that's what we did here. And then I said, well, what if I used a Rumen undegradable protein source like distillers to get that same rate of gain? So I did not change the amount of corn silage I was feeding, and in this case, this would not be ad libitum or free choice. They actually could eat more, but I kept it the same just to show you if I substituted these two, what would happen. And so now if I fed those 22 pounds of corn silage and I fed 2.8 pounds of distillers versus that 5.4 pounds of alfalfa, I get the same level of gain. If I fed corn silage free choice and I still fed that 2.8 pounds of distillers, I would get even more gain actually out of them. Okay, so the reason I wanted to show you is because oftentimes I get people thinking, well, the alfalfa is cheaper than the distillers. And so I just looked up hay prices this morning and said, okay, what's high quality or good quality alfalfa running? And it was $150 a ton. So if I fed 5.4 pounds per day, I am looking at almost 47 cents per head per day. If I did the distillers at $2.20 a ton, which I marked it up considerably, because I'm assuming we're going to western Nebraska here, then I'm still only at 34 cents. So that doesn't look like a huge difference, but that's a huge difference if you put that over a, let's say, 100-day feeding period. We can save a lot of money per calf. Now, the other thing I wanted to show you here is that, look, if I analyze the cost of this alfalfa, which is good alfalfa, on a pound of crude protein, and I do the same thing for the distillers, the distillers actually comes out to be just a little bit more expensive. But if I actually look at how I can make my performance and I look at it on a per head per day, it's cheaper. And so that's one of the challenges with using protein sources and comparing protein sources on growing calf rations. We really have to look at how the cattle will perform and how that will actually work out, because it does differ depending on how much Rumen degradable and how much Rumen undegradable. And now you're all going, well, now what do I do, right? So now what? Well, growing calf rations is probably one of the best places to get some what I'll call professional help. So our educators and some of our specialists, we're here to help you, and to help with growing rations is one of the things that we can do. So with that in mind, a couple things I really kind of want to let you think about. One is that if you want to come up with the best option for your situation, there's a couple things that you need to have when you call us, one of which is knowing what feed options you have. So what can you get a hold of? So I have these things on hand. I could get a hold of these things. Here's my costs for those. Having a forage analysis, especially if forage is going to be a high proportion of the diet, or you want to use that forage as a source of a supplement. And then your goals. When do you want to sell them? What's the rate of gains you want to achieve? If you don't know, we can talk through when you want to sell them and what that might look like in terms of looking at the cost of gain and then what market you might hit. So those are things we can help you think through. But the more information you have for us to begin with, the better that will be in terms of the conversation and the help we can give you.